Imagine, if you will, you're someone born in the mid-90s, having grown up, and you heard of this terrifying film called The Blair Witch Project, a movie that horror fans, friends, and early internet culture alike spent years building up as one of the scariest films ever made. Not just scary, but legendarily scary. A film that supposedly traumatized audiences at theaters, blurred the line between fiction and reality, and became this iconic benchmark for psychological horror that people still talked about. And because it's a found footage horror film on top of that, there's already this expectation that it's going to feel raw, immersive, and deeply unsettling in a way traditional horror films of that time often didn't. So eventually, a decade or so later, that same person finally sits down to watch this infamous horror classic, expecting this terrifying experience that horror culture had spent years upon years mythologizing, only to come away feeling something much stranger than fear. Disappointment. Not because the movie is bad, not because it lacks atmosphere, and not because its importance isn't obvious, but because the actual experience of watching it then, and even more so now in 2026, often doesn't match the terrifying reputation that people have built up around it. The realism is there, the atmosphere is there, and you can absolutely understand why audiences reacted the way they did, but the fear itself can feel strangely absent for modern reviewings, almost as if they're watching the idea of something terrifying rather than actually feeling terrified by it themselves. What makes Blair Witch 2016 so interesting, especially when viewed through the perspective of someone born in the mid to late 90s finally revisiting this franchise, is that while it may not be a perfect horror film, it arguably functions as a scarier horror experience than the original ever does for that same kind of viewer. And that sounds strange to say because the 1999 film is obviously the more important, more influential, and more historically respected movie. But fear and historical importance are not always the same thing. Blair Witch 2016 understands something the original no longer fully benefits from. Modern horror audiences often need a stronger sensory and psychological experience for fear to actually land and remain with them after the movie is finished. The movie takes the blueprints of the original, being lost in the woods, unseen danger, paranoia, disorientation, found footage chaos, and pushes those ideas much harder in ways designed for audiences raised in a very different horror landscape. The sound design is more aggressive, the visual instability is more overwhelming, the escalation is much more immediate, and the sense of panic feels far more relentless. It may lose some of the subtle realism that made the original such a cultural phenomenon, but for someone raised on modern horror, that trade-off often makes it a much more effective, fearful experience. And that's really where Blair Witch 2016 succeeds in a way the original often struggles with now, because it doesn't spend as much time relying purely on implication and audience imagination to do all the work. It actively tries to overwhelm the viewer in a way that modern horror audiences are much more responsive to. The woods feel darker, more hostile, and more unnatural. The soundscape is constantly unsettling. The disorientation feels more physically intense. And the film leans much harder into sensory panic rather than quiet psychological ambiguity. For viewers who grew up on horror that escalates aggressively and places them directly inside fear rather than quietly suggesting it from a distance, Blair Witch often hits harder simply because it understands those expectations better. It is louder, it is more chaotic, and sometimes less elegant, but it creates a much more immediate feeling of dread and panic for audiences who no longer find subtle realism alone enough to carry an entire horror film experience. That also becomes especially clear when looking at how Blair Witch handles visual and psychological escalation compared to the original. The 1999 film spends so much of its runtime building atmosphere through uncertainty, but Blair Witch takes that uncertainty and turns it into something far more aggressive and nightmarish. The unnatural stretching of time, the increasingly hostile environment, the distorted sense of panic, the distorted sense of space, the body horror elements, and the more direct confrontations with fear create a horror experience that feels much less emotionally distant from modern audiences. It may not be as restrained, and it may not have the same cultural subtlety, but for someone born in the era of internet horror, psychological horror games, analog horror, paranormal found footage, and more intense sensory filmmaking, the 2016 version often feels much closer to what modern audiences instinctively expect horror to do. Instead of waiting for horror atmosphere to slowly work its way under the skin, it actively attacks the viewer's senses in a way that feels far more immediate. And maybe that's why Blair Witch is such a strange sequel in hindsight, because while it may never surpass the original in terms of influence, legacy, or historical importance, it arguably surpasses it in something much simpler: actually being scarier for a generation that no longer responds to horror the same way audiences did in '99. It's not a perfect film, it can be messy, excessive, and far less subtle than the original, but fear isn't always about subtlety, it's about effectiveness. And for someone born in the mid to late 90s or later, raised in a horror landscape shaped by decades of escalation, Blair Witch 2016 often feels like the version of this story that understands how to make that fear work again. The original may still always be the blueprint, but for many modern audiences, the sequel is the one that actually feels more like a nightmare. One of the biggest reasons the Blair Witch Project no longer feels as frightening as its reputation suggests is because so much of its horror relies almost entirely on implication, realism, and audience imagination rather than direct emotional intensity. And while that absolutely worked for audiences in the late 90s, especially in an era where many people genuinely questioned whether the footage itself was real, modern horror audiences experience films very differently now. Found footage has become one of the most oversaturated horror formats imaginable, and because of that, the techniques Blair Witch pioneered no longer feel as fresh or shocking the way they once did. The shaky camera movement, the characters arguing while lost in the woods, the strange sounds at night, the constant ambiguity surrounding what's actually out there. All of those elements have been replicated so many times over the last 2 decades that modern viewers, or people rewatching it in the modern era, often recognize the structure immediately. Instead of creating fear through uncertainty, the movie can sometimes end up feeling predictable simply because the entire genre has spent years building directly off of what Blair Witch originally created. What once felt experimental and psychologically unnerving now often feels familiar simply because so many other films have borrowed from its formula. And maybe that's where a lot of the disappointment starts settling in while rewatching it now, because the film constantly feels like it's building towards terror without ever fully delivering the kind of emotional payoff modern audiences instinctively expect from horror anymore. Long stretches of the movie are built entirely around atmosphere, tension, and realism. But if those elements don't personally pull someone in emotionally, there's surprisingly little else to actually scare them. The woods feel isolated, the performances feel believable, and the movie does an excellent job creating the feeling of people slowly becoming emotionally exhausted and paranoid. But none of that automatically translates into fear for everyone rewatching it today, especially for viewers who grew up on later horror films that escalated tension far more aggressively. Blair Witch can end up feeling strangely restrained to the point of emotional distance. Instead of feeling trapped in a nightmare alongside the characters, modern viewers can sometimes feel more like they're observing an interesting horror experiment from the outside, appreciating the techniques without fully experiencing the terror it was once meant to create. That's also why the movie's most iconic scenes don't necessarily hit modern audiences with the same power anymore. Moments like the stick figures hanging in the trees absolutely remain memorable from a horror history perspective, but culturally they've become so heavily referenced, parodied, and discussed over the years that they no longer carry the same emotional shock they once did. The imagery itself became iconic long before many younger audiences ever watched the movie, which means people often go into Blair Witch already familiar with its biggest moments, and horror loses a huge amount of power once audiences already know what to expect emotionally before the film even begins. That sense of mystery and uncertainty, which terrified audiences in '99, simply don't exist in the same way anymore for newer viewers who have spent years seeing Blair Witch referenced across internet culture, horror discussions, memes, and countless other found footage films inspired directly by it. By the time many people finally watch it, some of its biggest moments have already become cultural images rather than shocking discoveries. and maybe that's why the film feels more important than it feels scary now. Because when modern audiences revisit Blair Witch today, it often feels less like a horror experience designed to terrify them, and more like a snapshot of a very specific cultural moment. The movie absolutely deserves credit for revolutionizing found footage horror and changing the genre forever, but historical importance and actual fear aren't always the same thing. And for a lot of people born after the era where Blair Witch first exploded culturally, the movie's horror simply weakened over time because audiences themselves changed. Horror evolved, found footage evolved, viewer expectations evolved. And while Blair Witch remains incredibly influential, influence alone doesn't automatically preserve fear, because the techniques that once felt groundbreaking eventually become familiar to everyone. Sometimes a film can remain legendary or no longer functioning as effective horror in the same emotional way it once did. The Blair Witch Project is still one of the most important horror films ever made, and its influence on found footage and psychological horror cannot be overstated. But importance and fear, as I've said, aren't the same thing, and that's where the movie feels so different from many modern viewers or many modern rewatchings. What once terrified audiences through realism, ambiguity, and cultural context now feels much more like a blueprint for horror than horror itself. And while it absolutely does deserve respect for changing the genre forever, actually rewatching it today can feel strangely underwhelming. Not because the movie failed, but because horror audiences, media culture, and the genre itself have evolved so much that the fear it once created simply doesn't hit the same way anymore.